The final morning of the summit dawned gray, the Alaskan sky swollen with heavy clouds. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter of the base with sharper vigilance, their boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The meeting rooms inside buzzed with tension, as if everyone sensed that the words spoken today would echo louder than those before. Donald Trump entered the hall flanked by advisors, his expression one of confidence bordering on triumph. He relished the cameras, knowing they would beam his image into millions of homes. Vladimir Putin followed, deliberate and calculating, his gaze scanning every corner like a man measuring the weight of history. Between them lay the stage for an announcement that could redefine alliances, and more quietly, inflame the divisions tearing through America. Ethan Cole sat toward the back, pen in hand, heart pounding. He had covered wars, elections, scandals, but none had felt so alive, so fragile. Every line he wrote seemed less like reporting and more like prophecy. He thought of the protests filling U.S. streets, voices rising in anger or pride. He thought of neighbors who had stopped speaking to each other, of men with guns standing guard at rallies, of young boys repeating slogans they barely understood. What happened here would either cool the fire or feed it. Dr. Marcus Hall, standing near the podium as a consultant, bore the weariness of a man who knew his words might be drowned by louder ones. His mind wandered to his father, who had marched decades earlier against segregation, believing the country was bending toward justice. Marcus wondered if that bend had straightened, or worse, bent backward. Still, he stood tall, prepared to speak if given the chance, determined not to let history's lessons be ignored. On the opposite side of the room, Richard Kane leaned forward, eyes burning with anticipation. This was the culmination of his vision. Strength, sovereignty, purity of message. For Kane, the summit represented the rebirth of a nation willing to stand firm, even if it meant alienating half its people. He believed history favored the bold, and he had no intention of softening that truth. The announcement began. Trump's voice boomed with practiced rhythm. He spoke of preserving America's traditions, of defending identity against dilution, of standing shoulder to shoulder with allies who respect strength. The words rolled across the room like thunder, unapologetic and sharp. Putin nodded with approval, his silence a form of applause. Ethan scribbled, his stomach twisting. He recognized the phrasing. It was not just policy, it was code, the kind that emboldened the loudest extremes. He glanced toward Hall, who clenched his jaw but did not flinch. Kane, on the other hand, nearly glowed, his chest rising with pride as though he had authored every syllable. When Trump finished, applause filled the hall. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the official narrative was set. Unity of strength, clarity of purpose, defiance against weakness. Yet beneath the polished headlines, the fracture deepened. Hall moved toward the microphones, his decision made in an instant. He spoke with quiet force, his voice slicing through the noise. Strength without justice is nothing but tyranny. Identity without inclusion is nothing but exclusion. We must not mistake boldness for wisdom, or pride for unity. The danger is not what is said here today, but what it gives permission for tomorrow. The room froze. Trump's aides bristled, Kane rose in outrage, Putin narrowed his eyes with disdain. But Ethan saw something else, truth trembling in the air, fragile but undeniable. He scribbled Hall's words, knowing they would ignite a storm once published. Kane advanced toward Hall, his voice sharp with fury. You dare undermine this moment. You dare suggest that protecting our people is tyranny. This is why America is weak, because of men like you who refuse to put pride above shame. Hall met his glare, steady and unbroken. Protecting people means all people, Kane. Not just those who look like you, not just those who cheer for you. If you build a nation by cutting others out, you don't build strength. You build walls that will collapse on you. The clash between them drew cameras, and suddenly the summit's final image was no longer Trump and Putin shaking hands. It was two Americans, locked in confrontation, representing the two futures that lay ahead. Outside the base, the world reacted instantly. Screens lit up with footage of the exchange. In some cities, cheers rang out at Hull's courage. In others, Kane's defiance became a rallying cry. Protests swelled, counter-protests answered. And the streets became an extension of Alaska's Hull. Ethan filed his story late that night. His words trembled on the page, but he chose honesty over comfort. He wrote of a summit that had united leaders but divided a nation. He described Hull's warning and Kane's defiance, capturing the truth that the conflict was not between countries but within America itself. And as he pressed send, he felt the weight of history pressing back. Trump departed Alaska with a smile, Putin with satisfaction, Kane with conviction, Hull with sorrow. Ethan remained behind, staring at the barren horizon, the icy winds carrying whispers of a country uncertain of its reflection. The summit was over, but the struggle had only begun. The battle lines of racism, nationalism, and identity had been redrawn, sharper than before, and every American would soon be forced to choose which vision they would march behind. And Ethan, pen still in hand, knew this was only the beginning of a story that would shape the soul of his nation. The news traveled faster than the wind that whipped across the Alaskan base. By the time Trump and Putin sat down for their private dinner, footage of their handshake and speeches had already ignited debates across America. In the South, rallies formed almost overnight, flags waving as voices chanted about strength and sovereignty. In the North, protests filled city streets, crowds holding signs that warned of creeping authoritarianism and exclusion. The summit had turned into more than diplomacy. It had become a mirror of America's fractured soul. Ethan Cole absorbed these developments with a journalist's mixture of fascination and dread. He stayed glued to the feeds, noting how each network spun the images to fit its audience. Some called it historic unity. Others called it dangerous alignment. For Ethan, the truth lived in neither extreme but in the widening gulf between them. His task wasn't just to describe events but to reveal the undercurrents pulling society apart. Inside the base, Dr. Marcus Hall became more vocal. He confronted Kane during a press briefing where journalists lingered too long and microphones picked up more than they should. "When you repeat phrases about purity and strength," Hall said sharply, "you embolden those who see their neighbors as enemies. You know what this means for Black and brown Americans who already feel like outsiders." Kane's jaw tightened, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of conflict. "What it means," he shot back, "is that we're finally putting America first. People are tired of division being used as a weapon." Trump's words inspire pride, not hate. Hall's reply was quieter, but it cut deeper. Pride at the cost of someone else's dignity is just hate wearing a mask. The room fell still, the kind of silence that suggests an argument isn't over but merely postponed for a larger stage. That night, Ethan walked with Hall under the dim floodlights outside the compound. "Do you think people will hear you?" Ethan asked. Hall sighed, his breath rising like smoke. "They'll hear me, but will they listen? Racism doesn't need loud orders to grow. It only needs permission. And permission often comes dressed as patriotism." Meanwhile, Kane worked tirelessly with Trump's aides to shape the narrative. He drafted speeches that leaned into risk-taking, daring, and protecting borders. His goal was clear: to frame Trump as a hero unafraid to defend his people. For Kane, this wasn't just politics. It was survival of the national identity he believed was slipping away. The contrast between Hall and Kane became the summit's hidden duel. Trump and Putin played their parts on the public stage, but these two men wrestled in the shadows, their words destined to ripple across America more powerfully than any treaty. Back in the United States, Ethan's editor called. "We need you to go harder," the voice demanded. "Our readers want clarity. Is this summit a victory or a warning?" Ethan hesitated before replying. "It's both. That's the problem. What they see as victory plants seeds that others see as danger. This story isn't about winners. It's about what kind of America comes out of this." His editor grumbled but let him file it his way. By the third day of the summit, tensions had grown visible even inside the base. Reporters whispered about protest movements swelling across U.S. cities, some already facing clashes with police. The air in Alaska felt heavier, as though the storm brewing thousands of miles away had reached them. During one session, Trump leaned across the table toward Putin. "The future belongs to the bold," he said, voice brimming with certainty. "Weakness only invites chaos. And America has had enough of chaos." Putin nodded slowly, his eyes betraying satisfaction. Ethan caught the exchange and wrote furiously, realizing the phrase would echo like a drumbeat in the days ahead. Hall watched too, but he didn't write. He only whispered to Ethan later, "That line will become a banner for some and a curse for others." Kane, on the other hand, was elated. He repeated the phrase to journalists, framing it as the summit's essence. "This is the declaration America needed," he said. "Strength, boldness, clarity." His voice carried the conviction of a man who believed history would remember Trump as a savior. But Ethan couldn't shake the images appearing on his phone. Streets filled with divided crowds, police lines clashing with citizens, families shouting across barricades. He saw signs reading "Strength without us is weakness and no future without all of us." He realized the summit wasn't just a meeting of leaders, it was a spark. And America, dry with tension, was already catching fire. That evening, Trump and Putin staged a joint press conference. Their words were cautious, but the undertones were unmistakable. Trump spoke of preserving identity, while Putin praised the courage to defend traditions. For those listening around the world, the alliance seemed pragmatic. But for Americans grappling with questions of race and belonging, it sounded like a validation of the most dangerous voices in their communities. When the conference ended, Ethan lingered at the back of the hall, notebook half closed. He glanced at Hall, who stood alone, silent, staring at the empty podiums. Ethan approached cautiously. "What do you see?" Ethan asked. Hall didn't turn. "A story that will be told for decades. Not about diplomacy, not about treaties, but about whether America chose to remember its mistakes or repeat them." Ethan felt the words lodge deep, heavier than any headline he could write. He realized then that this summit wasn't just about Trump or Putin. It was about the clash between Kane's dream of strength and Hall's warning of history. And whichever vision America embraced would shape the meaning of belonging for generations. Outside, the Alaskan night closed in, cold and unforgiving. Inside, the summit pressed forward. The world waited for outcomes measured in deals and documents. But Ethan knew the real outcome was already unfolding. In chants on American streets, in whispered fears at kitchen tables, in the sharpened lines between neighbors. And as the final day approached, the stakes had never felt higher. Morning broke harshly over the base, the snow reflecting pale gold under a reluctant sun. Ethan Cole stood outside the press compound with his coffee cooling too quickly in the wind, replaying fragments of the first day. He knew what his editors expected. A story about geopolitics, about sanctions and Arctic resources. But he also knew the deeper story lived in shadows, in the rhetoric, in the silences, in how the spectacle of two men shaking hands would ripple through divided societies. Trump arrived at the hall with his usual flourish, red tie snapping against the wind. Behind him trailed Senator Holloway, his cowboy hat returning like a symbol of rugged defiance. Putin entered moments later, flanked by stone-faced Russian aides. The choreography was deliberate, and Ethan noted how every gesture seemed crafted for the camera, for history, and for power. Inside, discussions turned toward security and trade, but it was Trump's improvisations that caught attention. "We have to protect our people first," he declared, pounding the table softly for emphasis. "Borders mean safety. Safety means strength." Holloway nodded approvingly, his eyes burning with pride. Across from them, Putin allowed the faintest smirk, as though hearing echoes of his own philosophy spoken in another tongue. Ethan scribbled quickly, aware that the words carried weight beyond these walls. In America, such phrases landed differently depending on who was listening. For some, they meant reassurance. For others, exclusion. Ethan could already imagine the effect in communities where immigrants and minorities feared being told, again, that they were outsiders. Dr. Marcus Hall listened with his usual intensity, fingers steepled under his chin. When Trump spoke of preserving the greatness of our culture, Hall's lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan recognized that expression. It was the face of a man cataloging the past, measuring the present against patterns too familiar. After the session, Ethan managed to walk beside him. "You look troubled," Ethan said quietly. Hall glanced at him. "Language isn't neutral, Ethan. Every phrase plants a seed. I've seen what grows when leaders water those seeds." His tone carried the weight of centuries. Meanwhile, Richard Kane, the strategist, was jubilant. Outside the hall, he cornered a group of journalists and declared, "This summit proves Trump is still the only one willing to speak hard truths. America needs unity, not weakness." His words dripped with confidence, but Ethan caught the undertone. It wasn't unity in diversity that Kane envisioned, but unity under a singular, narrow definition of what it meant to be American. The central conflict sharpened as the summit entered its second day. Trump framed himself as a defender of national identity, using language that resonated deeply with some and alienated others. Putin played along, reinforcing the idea that nations must guard their purity to remain strong. Together, they seemed to craft a narrative where power thrived on division, where strength was measured not by inclusion but by exclusion. For Ethan, the question loomed: what did this mean for America already struggling with racial fault lines? He thought back to Holloway, who during a break had told a group of aides, "This is the reset we've needed. People are tired of walking on eggshells." The senator's words, though not spoken into microphones, revealed the sentiment lurking beneath the polished speeches. Later that afternoon, the press was allowed limited access again. Trump, flushed with energy, gestured broadly as he spoke about taking risks others wouldn't dare. He leaned toward Putin with the familiarity of a partner, not a rival. Cameras flashed, immortalizing the image of two leaders who had built their power on nationalist visions, now appearing side by side. Ethan wrote in his notebook, "The handshake was the symbol. This alliance of language is the substance. Strength here means someone else's weakness." Back at the media center, he overheard Kane arguing with Hall. The strategist's voice was sharp, confident. "You academics always see ghosts. People don't care about nuance. They care about strength." Hall didn't flinch. "Strength without justice becomes tyranny. And tyranny, history teaches us, always chooses its scapegoats." His words cut through the heated air like ice. Ethan realized both men embodied the clash unfolding in the nation beyond Alaska's snow. Kane represented the triumphalist vision, exclusive, uncompromising. Hall embodied the warning, the reminder of cycles that had destroyed societies before. And in the middle, Trump and Putin supplied the theater, their choices reverberating across a world eager for direction, fearful of change. As the day closed, Ethan filed his report but felt unsatisfied. The headlines would read of cooperation, of bold stances, of two leaders willing to gamble on a new order. Yet the real story, he knew, was more insidious. It was about the subtle legitimization of rhetoric that painted outsiders as threats. It was about the seeds planted in every speech, seeds that would sprout in towns and cities thousands of miles away from this frozen stage. Standing outside in the cold, Ethan looked across the base at the glowing hall where the summit continued. He understood now that this wasn't just about geopolitics or strategy. It was about who would feel they belonged in America when the echoes of Alaska reached home. And the echoes, he feared, were already beginning to grow louder. The plane's engines roared against the biting Alaskan wind, its polished fuselage catching the pale glint of a reluctant sun. Soldiers lined the runway at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, their rifles slung but their eyes alert. The world's attention had turned to this frozen outpost, a place more accustomed to long nights and icy storms than to history-making diplomacy. Yet today, Donald J. Trump, former president and relentless force in American politics, stepped down from the jet with the self-assurance of a man walking into a theater he already owned. At the opposite end of the tarmac, Vladimir Putin descended the narrow stairs of his own aircraft, his figure small but taut with control. He adjusted his coat without breaking stride, his expression set in that familiar mask of indifference. When the two men met at the center, their handshake lasted longer than necessary. Tight, deliberate, more performance than greeting. Cameras snapped furiously. Across the world, commentators speculated on posture, on grip, on whether Trump's slight lean forward was eagerness or dominance. From the sidelines, Ethan Cole, a political correspondent covering the summit for an international news outlet, scribbled in his notepad. The meeting was historic, but it was also combustible. Alaska was chosen not by accident but by calculation, a halfway point between Washington and Moscow, a place heavy with military presence and raw natural power. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment, but what pressed harder was the subtext, the undercurrent of race and nationalism simmering below the surface of every word these two men might exchange. Trump waved broadly to the cameras, a showman as always, before turning toward the convoy of armored vehicles waiting to whisk him and Putin into the heart of the base. Ethan noted the presence of Senator James Holloway, a staunch Trump ally, standing nearby with his trademark cowboy hat tucked under one arm. Holloway leaned close to a fellow aide and muttered something that drew a smirk, but Ethan couldn't catch the words. He didn't need to. Holloway's presence alone symbolized the alignment of Trump's politics with a segment of America deeply invested in preserving a particular vision of national identity. Inside the secured conference hall, the air was stiff with formality. American and Russian flags stood at equal height, the symmetry choreographed to deny advantage. Trump adjusted his red tie, then clapped Putin on the back as if greeting an old friend. Putin neither flinched nor encouraged the gesture, his eyes cool as glass. Around the table sat aides, translators, and military advisors, but the real focus narrowed to two men who thrived on theater as much as on power. Ethan was granted limited access as part of the press pool, stationed behind a cordon at the room's edge. He studied their faces, searching for cracks in composure. Trump's jaw jutted forward with confidence, but Ethan had covered him long enough to recognize that the bravado often masked calculation. Putin, in contrast, betrayed nothing. To Ethan, the Russian leader resembled a chess grandmaster, every move premeditated, every silence strategic. The opening remarks were stiff, filled with diplomatic courtesies about peace, security, and cooperation. But underneath, the tension was undeniable. The United States had sanctioned Russia repeatedly. Russia had answered with hostility. And yet, here they were in Alaska, shaking hands as if they could redraw the map with nothing more than rhetoric. Ethan wrote quickly, handshake diplomacy, masking fractures at home, optics over substance, domestic ripples inevitable. When Trump began to speak about restoring strength and putting America first, Ethan caught the glance of Richard Kane, a conservative strategist sitting among the invited observers. Kane leaned forward, his eyes gleaming, as if every word Trump uttered validated years of ideological battles. To Kane, this summit wasn't just geopolitics. It was vindication, proof that Trump remained the singular voice capable of confronting global giants on equal terms. But in the back of the room, Dr. Marcus Hall, a historian specializing in racial politics, looked unsettled. Ethan knew him from past interviews, measured, deliberate, and unflinching in his critiques of power. Hall's presence as part of an academic advisory group lent balance to the coverage, but Ethan wondered if his concerns would be drowned out in the flood of spectacle. Hall's eyes tracked Trump's gestures closely, as though he were decoding not just a speech but a message to America's marginalized communities. As the talk shifted behind closed doors and the press was ushered out, Ethan walked briskly toward the media tent, replaying the scene in his mind. What troubled him wasn't simply Trump and Putin in the same room. It was the symbolism. For many Americans, especially minorities, Trump's return to the global stage stirred fears of a revival of rhetoric that had long left scars. Ethan remembered the chants from rallies past, the comments about immigrants, the dismissive tone toward black communities. To some, those were political gaffes. To others, they were reminders of fragility in their place within the American fabric. Hours later, as night fell and the wind howled across the base, the summit's first day concluded without any dramatic announcements. Still, Ethan sensed that history had shifted. The handshake, the optics, the carefully staged unity, these were more than images for headlines. They were signals. He overheard Kane on the phone outside the press tent saying, "This shows America isn't weak anymore. People need to understand strength when they see it." Meanwhile, Hall gave a brief interview before disappearing into the cold night. His words lingered with Ethan. When leaders normalize alliances built on exclusionary ideals, the reverberations don't stop at borders. They seep into everyday life, into who feels safe, into who belongs. Ethan paused with his recorder still running, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He realized the story wasn't just about Trump and Putin. It was about what their meeting symbolized to the men and women living far from this icy tarmac, in neighborhoods already strained by inequality and prejudice. As he closed his notebook, Ethan glanced back at the base, lights glowing faintly against the dark Alaskan wilderness. The summit was only beginning, but already the fault lines of its impact were visible. The world would remember the handshake, but Ethan suspected America would remember the echo. And the echo, he feared, would not be one of peace.